Chess, like life, is about balancing competing interests. While chess isn't about balancing work, school, friends, family, hobbies, it is about balancing some key metrics that will tell you whether or not you're winning or losing a game. We're going to focus on piece activity and king safety, and then put that within the overall purview of evaluating a chess position. Round three of the candidates, white is Vidit Gujrathi, black is Praggnanandhaa. Both are from India, and we have a Spanish game at the beginning. Super, super common. Again, super common. And now black strikes because Pragg is a total sicko, and he plays this gambit, plays f5 here. And what does Vidit do? Vidit's not afraid. No, he doesn't take the pawn. He offers his own pawn. He counter gambits. Pragg takes, and Vidit has this push forward. This is a thematic move. It restricts white from, getting his pieces into the game. In Pragg here, he strikes over at the queen side, and Vidit, he moves back. I'm going to take just a moment here to talk through evaluation of a position. So to evaluate a position, you look at these 5 things right below me: material, king safety, piece activity, etc. We can see that while black is up a pawn, basically every other small aspect of the strategic game, white is doing a little bit better. He's got more space. He's got 2 pieces developed versus black 1. That's, piece activity. And when it comes to structure, this pawn is very weak. For black, that pawn is most likely going to fall. And so what does black do right here? He targets this active piece by white, gives up that pawn, develops his own piece. Now he's targeting this pawn right here and gives up another pawn. How do we evaluate this position? And as you can see, the piece material has completely flipped. Now white is up a pawn, but the black king, it's a little bit safer. It's a little bit closer to being able to castle. Previously, there were, 2 pieces in the way. Now there's only 1. Previously, white had this bishop here kind of lining up here. Now the king's a little bit safer. And when it comes to pawn structure, this pawn for white might be a little bit weak. And then these 2 pawns are doubled up. That could be a positive, could be a negative. I mean, this rook now is active in the game. So again, it's all a game of trade-offs when it comes to the game of chess. So black here tries to, break out a little bit, gives himself a little bit of space. White lines up against the king. And in this position right here, white boldly plows forward, forces this queen to move, and takes yet even more space. But this pawn can be a bit of a liability. Black's queen here slides over, lines up here against the g2 square, and now white here prevents black from castling, making the king even more delicate. Surprisingly enough, there actually is a checkmate threat in the air for white. Let's say that black decides to grab this pawn right here. Can you see the checkmate here for white? Well, it starts out with white grabbing this pawn and giving up the knight. That's a check. The only move that black has here is this move right here, and now this weak diagonal on the king. White takes advantage of it. That happens all the time in beginner opening. That's why you really, really want to be careful about ever moving your f-pawn, either as white or black. We'd have to move over here, and this right there is checkmate. So instead of that, black, he has to move forward here to prevent that checkmating idea, but also it forces white to move his knight. The knight, he moves backwards, and then black, again, pushes forward, gaining a little bit more space, forcing white to, hey, what are you going to do here with your bishop? If the bishop moves back to h4, then, this is going to come forward. Black here jumps in front of this pawn and forms a blockade. The knight is the best piece to blockade a pawn. It prevents it from moving forward because all of the normal squares the knight is able to attack, it's still able to attack. White here tries to continue forward with the attack, wants to break open some of the queen side structure. It looks like black's going to be going over to the queen side, and so he's thinking, why don't I preeminently, take advantage of that? Bringing his own piece forward yet again. And with this castling by white and the bishop to g7, let's pause one more time to evaluate this position. And we could see here, black's turn the tables yet again. White still has that pawn, But the piece activity, I mean, look at these bishops just plowing down over here. And when it comes to king safety, that black king was a little bit tender before. But how is white going to be able to get to the king? The king, while white's king is definitely a little bit safer, it's nothing super, super crazy. And when it comes to space, black is kind of locked in here on these squares. We see the bishops, we see the queen already starting to eye some other key squares and structure. This pawn here is a little bit weak for white. I mean, this pawn here is a little bit weak for black as well, but this white pawn is a little bit easier for black to get to, so I get a slight advantage to black, and then obviously we still have these doubled pawns for white. White brings his pieces over. The king is finally able to castle, and white here tries to step forward, tries to make something happen, and instead of trying to stubbornly hold on to this pawn, black gives that pawn up because all he's cared about is his own piece activity. This knight push right here either blocks off this bishop from the action or removes a blockader from this e7 square. In this case, it removes that blockader, and again, black goes up a pawn. These top-level players, they're not worried about one pawn here or there. They're worried about what are my active plans? And do I have more space? Do I have more attacking chances? And it opens up this check, pushes forward, attacks here, and now we have a pawn all the way on the 7th rank, one more piece forward, and he'd be able to make a queen. We have this bishop dropping back, attacking the queen, forcing a response, and this knight jumps forward. And we can see here that white is, again, not so worried about giving back that pawn. Black continues, sets up here, tries to block off this e1 square from a white rook landing into it, and white, not interested, says, you know what, sir, please get out of my way. I need to have active pieces here. And we have, with this capture, maybe this b3 pawn's going to be a little bit weak, but if that pawn's captured, then, well, that opens up lines against the king. So let's see here what white has in mind. White jumps over, is double attacking this bishop. Something needs to happen there. The bishop moves back, and white is able to recapture this pawn and reestablish material equality. Only momentarily, of course, because black recaptures that e7 pawn, goes back up a pawn again, and white here decides, you know what, this knight here is not quite as active as this bishop, still attacking this g2 square. Let me go harass it a little bit, and in a couple more moves, we have a trade of that bishop, but the trade happens a little bit too late. This pawn is so far advanced and is able to, I'm sure you guessed it, capture this f2 square and drawing the white king into the open. That's probably not going to be a good idea. After this captures, let's re-look at our evaluation. And black here, not only up a pawn, also with all sorts of attacks rolling down, forcing down on white's king position. The king on white is right here in the middle of the board on f2 versus, hiding behind, some good cover of some of his own friends. And the only thing that white really has going for him is space. Having space here into his opponent's half of the board, that unfortunately is often the least important of our 5 strategic ideas. White here decides to capture, trade off those queens because he needs to relieve some of this pressure, and he throws forward g4. The idea being is if he had to give up either the g2 pawn or the h5 pawn, and to give up the g2 pawn this way, he's able to preserve this h5 pawn. But unfortunately, with this kind of swarming action here, it's just not going to be quite enough. And with this over here, this check, this is going to force a rook trade. Let's just go this way, and we have some sort of a trade looking like this. And a 3 versus 1, it's just not going to be enough. Black's going to win this game. This one goes to Pragg. As we get to our next game, keep in mind this is part of a series where we go through all of these key strategic ideas. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Our last match was an all India match. This is an all American match. We've got Hikaru Nakamura with the white pieces and Fabiano Caruana with the black pieces. Two of the favorites here for the candidates tournament. We have, a very normal looking Spanish, whatever. Everyone's played this a million times. I'm going to skip through a lot of this stuff in the opening. We have, after this trade, this D3 pawn is going to be a potential weakness. It's a backwards pawn. It can't move forward because this is restricting here. So potentially black's going to be able to pile up on it. And you might be looking, well, what happens if white just grabs this pawn right here? Black has this counterattack, and after all the trades, there's a fork here on the rook. So that e5 pawn, it is not quite available for free. So white here moves back, and after this pushes his d3 pawn forward, gets rid of it off the board. That was one of his weaknesses. He doesn't have that weakness anymore. And after this trade, white has an isolated queen's pawn. Having an isolated pawn without any pawns to protect it or move forward to protect it, that is a structural long-term weakness. And black here blockades that pawn, prevents it from moving forward, and now black will be able to build up a lot of pressure against that pawn. At least that's normally the plan against an isolated pawn. So I'm going to bring up our analysis board. We have white's got a little bit more space, a little bit more piece activity, but he has a structural weakness here on d4. And so the game continues forward, and after a little bit of shuffling, this rook jumps up here, attacks this knight, double attacks this knight, so there needs to be a response. The knight moves back, and then this a3 move restricts the knight's movements. None of those squares are available to it. Game continues. And after this trade, white gives up his bishop pair. And let's take a quick look where we're at with the evaluation. So not too much different. Black's king looks very safe with all of these pieces in front of it. White's got a little bit more activity than he did a couple moves ago. And we have this kind of silly looking rook move to block the queen trade, maybe looking for some sort of tricks. And we have this h4 move by white. He's really hoping that this gets captured, and now we'd have this pin here on the black knight, would lead to a lot of complications. And in a couple more moves here, we see that white has lined up the double stack here on the e-file. The queen is, instead of being here, now it's over here, and our evaluation is a little bit different. We've got a bit more activity, a bit more space, but the structural weakness of this d4 pawn is still there, though black's not really doing much to take advantage of it. That knight moves backwards, the rook moves forward, the queen moves backwards. Do you notice a trend? The white pawn moves forwards, and the black bishop moves backwards, and the black bishop moves backwards yet again. And all of these backwards moves by black, all these forward moves by white, it's just getting a little bit less and less safe for the black king. And right here, white is setting up a bit of a nasty trap. And that trap is realized. You're going to notice that bar goes way, way up. Are you able to see what Hikaru had an option to play here in the game? I'll give you just a couple seconds. And I'm just kidding with you guys. Obviously, Hikaru found it. It's this check right here. The bishop is blocking the king from getting out. And amazingly enough, black has back rank checkmate issues. This queen's being attacked, and this queen is threatening checkmate. In this position, black resigns. Hikaru's able to take this game down. This push and pull between material and king safety is extremely intriguing to me. Like Yasser, I like to be a pawn grubber, but I need to channel my inner tall. In our last game, we've got Vidit with the white pieces. He lost that first game we looked at, and Hikaru with the black pieces won the second game we looked at. These two are facing off against each other. The candidates is a double round robin tournament, so every player plays every other player twice in it. And we have, an Italian, and this is the first real surprise of that, where Hikaru lunges forward with g5. Hikaru came prepared to all of these games. He's going after a win. Let's see what our evaluation has to say about it. Maybe advantage over to white on that, but very, very close. And it gives you a little bit more space in the short term. In the long term, there might be some long term weaknesses. We'll see how it plays out. Obviously, Hikaru keys within his prep, and we have a5. And Hikaru's weakening the other side of his position. I mean, maybe he was thinking about castle and queenside before. He's already weakened his kingside position, and so maybe it's not going to be quite as easy for him to castle either way. A4 preventing a4 himself, and then black does commit, goes over to the king side. We have a bunch of shuffling around, both players lining up here in the center of the board with their rooks and queens. And black here with both here. White maybe a little bit behind on that development. The queen moves over, bishop back, and after this trade and this push forward, we have a trade in the center of the board and this e5 move. I'm going to bring up a second evaluation just so we can try to figure out, like, hey, what's going on with this position? Material is still equal, but a lot of the other things are pretty well balanced. White's got a little bit more space. His pawn's over in black's camp. And, maybe a little bit more piece activity as pieces are a little bit more forward. This bishop's being blunted by this. Same thing, this rook is just staring into a pawn. And then when it comes to structure, we mentioned that moving the pawns in front of this king, this might be a little bit weak later. However, we'll see here in a couple of moves, black has his own ideas. After this trade, this pawn is going to be weak here for white. So both players have their own structural weaknesses in the position. And as the game progresses forward, that simplification over there, and white goes up a pawn. And we have this giant trade here in the center. And after rook to d3, we'll do our final evaluation for this game. And we can see here that white's gone up a pawn. He's gotten rid of his only weakness here on the e5 square. Black still has these potential weaknesses over here on the king side. And after this move by black, white is infiltrating and then eyeing this weak pawn, grabs it right away. And one quick misstep by black, his defense was holding on by a thread, and white jumps into the position. He's threatening checkmate here on f7. Let's say that we have, this captures here to, try to prevent that. That's not going to work because now this rook is no longer defended. So he brings his queen back to defend. And now this queen's jumping over. He's going to jump into this square here. And I don't need to tell you, that's going to be checkmate. After the king moves over, this goes here to check the king and then open up and remove this escape square. This last desperate attempt and best move, most fun move. This captures right here, and the game ends here with Hikaru resigning as black because I don't need to tell you that's not going to work out for him. And Hikaru falls 0-2 to Vidit in this candidates tournament. The next concept we'll hit in depth is pawn structure, something that drives the strategy for most high-level games. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. Have a great day, guys.